Open your calendar for next week and read it honestly, one block at a time. A few of those blocks you chose on purpose. You can point to the moment you decided and you decide the same way again. Most of them, though, just accumulated. A recurring meeting nobody has questioned in 2 years, and maybe a yes you gave because the no felt too expensive. A Saturday already spoken for before the week began, and underneath the calendar, there is a quieter layer that never gets a time slot at all. The project you should start, the conversation you should finally have, the idea you should test in public instead of rehearsing in private. Those don't get scheduled. They just follow you from one week into the next. I want to begin there because a calendar is a kind of page, and a page is never really blank. When you don't write on it, that doesn't leave it empty, it leaves it open. And sooner or later, someone else fills it. Here is where I'm going so you can decide early whether it's worth your time. Every I should, every line in your week you've never actually examined is a sentence, and every sentence has an author. Either it's you or it's someone you've deferred to for so long that you stopped noticing the handwriting wasn't yours. There are only about 5 of those authors. You'll recognize at least one before I've finished describing them, and by the end I'll hand you a 4-step test. Name the author, write down the specific worst case, sort it into a must, a should, or a can, and check it against reality, along with the one thing that has to happen in your body, not just your head, before any of that actually moves you. I'll lean on a few real studies as we go, and I'll tell you exactly where each one stops. I want to be honest that this is a lens, yeah? So like this, not a proof. A calendar is not literally a manuscript, and sometimes an unexamined block is just, well, it's neutral inertia, a habit running on empty, nobody's handwriting in particular. I'm not going to pretend every open space is being secretly authored by someone else. Now, before I go any further with the calendar, I have to name something the calendar quietly leaves out, because for some of you, it is not a side case, it is the whole case. Not every page gets written by deferral. Some of it gets torn. A death, a diagnosis, a divorce you did not choose, a loss that broke your life clean in half. Nobody defers their way into grief. It arrives at 3 in the morning and writes whole paragraphs into your life without your consent. If that is where you are, I'm not going to insult you by calling it a scheduling problem. You do not rate the handwriting on a catastrophe and calmly reclassify it. The page got torn, and authorship there does not begin with choosing the sentence, because you never got to choose it in the first place. It begins much later and much lower down with the only thing that was ever actually yours, what that sentence is going to mean and who you become on the other side of it. That is not reading done from a comfortable chair. It is something you get back slowly with your hands when you're able. I won't pretend it's the same work as reworking a calendar, but the pen, when your hand is steady enough to hold it again, is the same pen. I'm putting that first, not last, because it's the deeper version of everything else I'm about to say. The rest of this is mostly about the gentler kind, the sentences you can still choose, but the same pen serves both. This matters most, I think, for people who are not short on insight, and I suspect that describes a lot of us here. We've read the books we can describe with real precision the change we'd make if we made it. We know which conversation we're avoiding and roughly why. So the gap is not a knowledge gap. It sits in the narrow space between knowing and doing. And that space is very easy to fill with, well, somebody else's handwriting. And here is something the self-help version usually leaves out. In modern life, deferring has almost no friction, and that is not an accident. There's always a reasonable sounding voice ready to tell you what someone in your position does, wants, and settles for, and much of that voice is manufactured. There are industries whose entire business is supplying it, feeds engineered to keep it arriving, an economy that earns something every time you hand the pen to the nearest default instead of stopping to read. You don't go looking for it, it's delivered. So when you feel the pull of the authors I'm about to describe, remember that some of them were amplified onto you on purpose. This is not only a private failure to read your own handwriting. Part of it is engineered, which does not remove your hand from the pen, but it should stop you from treating the whole thing as a personal defect. Hold on to that, because when we get to the remedy, I'm not going to leave the machine out of it. Now, the honest objection shows up fast, and it deserves to be met head on. You might say, well, but I did choose these things, and even where I deferred, deferring isn't weakness. Listening to people who know more than I do is just good sense. Not every should is a cage. And sometimes that is exactly right. Some of the sentences other people wrote into your script are load-bearing. A mentor's caution that saved you from a real mistake. A standard you inherited that genuinely serves you. Pulling those out wouldn't be freedom, it would be vandalism. So I'm not going to tell you every borrowed sentence is a chain. That would be too simple, and it would be false. Here's the harder part. You cannot tell an inherited should from a chosen one by how it feels. Both feel like yours. A belief you absorbed at age 8 and a conclusion you reasoned your way to last month sit in the same place in your mind and speak in the same confident voice. The feeling of ownership is not evidence of authorship. The only way to actually know who wrote a sentence is to stop and read the handwriting, and most of us almost never do. So let me name the handwriting, because the authors aren't infinite. One is a current authority figure, someone real, present in your life right now, whose reaction is costly enough that you quietly organize yourself around it. It's the manager whose raised eyebrow rewrites your whole week before you've finished your coffee. You draft the harder email, soften it twice, and send the version that won't cost you anything. This author has real power because the consequences are real. Another is a past authority figure, no longer in the room, but still speaking in your head. And you can spot this one by its grammar because it talks to you in the second person. Well, you can just quit. Or you can't always overreach. Listen closely and you'll hear that these aren't sentences you composed. They were said to you once by a parent or a teacher or a coach, and then installed and left running. You're no longer being assessed by them. You've quietly taken over the job of assessing yourself in their voice. The one I find most interesting is an imaginary critic, not a specific person, a composite, a faceless they. You write the paragraph, your thumb hovers, and then people will think deletes it for you. But when you try to point at who they are, well, there's nobody there. That's exactly why this author is so hard to fire. You can't argue with they because that has no face. There is no one to persuade, no one who could ever grant you permission because the judge you're afraid of doesn't literally exist, and yet it can shut down more of your life than any real person ever has. Then there is a peer group's prevailing opinion. Like what people like you do, what people like us would never. You never sat down and agreed to belong to it. You just started matching it. Car, hours, the opinions you keep to yourself at that particular table, and on how strong that pull is, we actually have some evidence. In the 1950s, the psychologist Solomon Asch set people in a group and asked them to judge which of several lines matched a reference line. The answer was obvious, but the rest of the group, working with Asch, deliberately said the same wrong answer out loud. Across those studies, about 3/4 of participants went along with the obviously wrong group at least once, and roughly a third of the critical answers conformed against what the person could plainly see. I want to be careful with what that shows. It was a lab task with a very clean stimulus. Later work found conformity varies a lot with culture and group size, and that adding even one dissenter drops it sharply. And it measures what people say out loud more than what they privately believe. So it's not proof we're helpless sheep, but it is a serious demonstration that the visible opinion of a group can override the direct evidence of your own senses. And if it can do that with a line on a card, it at least makes the far messier private version, the shape of a whole life bending to people like us, plausible. The last author is the widest, a cultural script. What someone like you at your age in your role is supposed to want, own, and have achieved by now. And notice what this author almost always tells you to do. More. Want more, own more, build more, have arrived at more of something by now. It's worth stopping there, because the most invisible sentence of all might be the one that says a full calendar and a public project are what a life is made of. That too is handwriting, and you're allowed to read it and disagree. Authorship isn't only adding sentences and crossing out the borrowed ones. Sometimes it's crossing out your own on purpose, choosing less, choosing quiet, deciding that it's enough is a legitimate sentence to write, even when the script insists that wanting less is a failure of nerve. Some of the most authored lives I've seen are also the emptiest calendars, and that emptiness was chosen line by line against a script that called it laziness. And that word, script, is where I want to slow down, because there is a difference between a natural law and a man-made rule. A natural law doesn't care what you believe about it. Step off a roof and gravity applies whether or not you consent. A man-made rule is different. It's social. It only has power for as long as enough people keep agreeing to it. The trouble is that when a rule is old enough or repeated often enough, it starts to feel like a law. The imaginary critic feels like gravity. The cultural script feels like physics. And so we obey a man-made sentence with the same automatic surrender we'd give an actual law of the universe. That is the error. We treat a rule that could be renegotiated as if it were a fact that can't. Here I have to put myself on the table because I catch myself doing exactly this. For a long time, there was a sentence in my own margins about publishing my ideas. It sounded like caution. I needed to be more complete before I put it out. A reasonable sounding sentence, but when I actually read the handwriting, it wasn't mine, and it wasn't really about quality. It was the imaginary critic, a faceless they, who'd misread it, take it out of context, decide I wasn't qualified. Nobody specific, which meant there was no one I could ever satisfy. So the honest translation of not ready yet was waiting for permission from a judge who doesn't exist. I'd let an author with no face write one of the most important lines in my week. Once I could see the author, the useful question stopped being, am I brave enough? And became, what kind of sentence is this really? It helps to sort our expectations into 3 levels. A must, where the consequences of ignoring are real and serious. A should, where the consequence is softer, some criticism, some guilt, with some temporary disapproval, uncomfortable but survivable. And a can, where you're genuinely free, where acting might bring something good and not acting usually costs you almost nothing. Most of the sentences the 5 authors write for us are shoulds and cans that have been quietly promoted to musts. The disapproval of the peer group gets filed as a threat to survival. The imaginary critic's verdict gets treated as a fact about your worth. And so you feel the full resistance of a genuine must around an action that, read accurately, is only a can. And that misclassification is not free. Believing the pen belongs to someone else is not a harmless, neutral position. There's a study I keep coming back to, run by Alan Langer and Judith Rodin in 1976 in a nursing home. One group of residents was given more control over small, real things like their own plans to look after, a genuine say in their daily choices. A comparison group had those same things done for them. The group with more control became more alert, more active, and rated their well-being higher. A later follow-up even reported differences in how long people lived. Well, I won't lean too hard on that last part. It's a small single institution study. The mortality follow-up hasn't been replicated as robustly as the short-term effects, and the mechanisms are still argued over. So I won't tell you control extends your life, but the short-term finding is sturdy enough to say this plainly. Having a hand in authoring your own days isn't a luxury layered on top of well-being. It looks like one of its ingredients, which is why deferring is itself a choice and not a neutral one. Picture standing on one of those moving walkways in an airport. You can stand still, and standing still feels like doing nothing, a neutral position, but you're still being carried toward wherever the belt was set to go. That's still an image, and images can't cheat, so there's the literal version. Your circumstances keep changing whether or not you act. The week fills, the relationship shifts, the opportunity closes. Not deciding doesn't freeze the situation in place. It just lets the default outcome proceed and hands the pen to whichever of the 5 authors is nearest. So authorship, the way I mean it, doesn't start with a grand rebellion, but I want to be clear from the start about what this is for, because on its own, a clean 4-step tool is exactly the trap. You can run all 4 steps in your head by Tuesday and still not have the conversation on Thursday. I know, because I have done precisely that. So don't treat these steps as the change. Treat them as evidence gathering for one small action, because the change doesn't finish in your head. Your body has to watch the feared consequence fail to arrive. That's the whole mechanism. And I'm saying it here right next to the tool so you don't mistake the tool for the cure. With that in mind, take a single should out of your margins, like one sentence, not your whole life. First, name the author out loud. Is this my current boss? A voice from 20 years ago, still talking to me in the second person. A they with no face. People like us. What someone in my role is simply supposed to want. Then second, and this is the step most people skip, write down the actual worst thing that happens if you ignore it. Not the vague dread, the specific consequence in one sentence. Third, look at what you wrote and classify it. Must, should, or can. And fourth, check it against reality. Has that worst case ever actually happened to you or to anyone you can name? Most faceless critic musts don't survive that 4th step. They were never tested. They were only ever obeyed. And there is a 5th move that isn't about your own handwriting at all, because I told you I wouldn't leave the machine out of it. Some of these authors don't live in your past. They're delivered to you fresh every hour. You cannot outclassify an infinite incoming stream of shoulds. There will always be more arriving than you can read. So aim at the supply, not only your private sorting of it. Mute the feed that keeps telling you what people like you want. Unsubscribe from the voice that reliably leaves you feeling behind. Cancel the recurring block nobody defends. Sometimes authorship isn't reading a sentence more carefully, it's turning down the volume on the machine that writes faster than you ever could. I want to be honest about the risk because the honest version is the only useful one. Authorship isn't the same as defiance, and picking up the pen doesn't mean setting fire to every sentence someone else wrote. Some of the authors got some of it right. The current authority figure with power over your income has that power for real. Rewriting a sentence you deferred to at work can carry a genuine cost, and I won't pretend the disapproval you fear is always imaginary. Sometimes it's a real must. The point isn't to become someone who reflexively rejects every borrowed line. That's just deference wearing a rebel's costume. The point is precision. To stop letting a faceless critic classify a can as a must. To keep what's yours to keep on purpose and to know why. There's one more piece of evidence I find quietly encouraging. James Pennebaker and the researchers who followed him have spent decades studying what happens when people write reflectively about their own experience in a structured, meaning-making way. Across many studies, that kind of narrative writing is associated with measurable improvements in some physical and psychological outcomes. I want to keep it in proportion. The effects are generally small, they're not uniform, they don't show up for everyone or every topic, and the mechanisms are still debated. And it's writing about your life in the ordinary sense, not literally drafting a script of the kind I'm describing, but it points in a direction I trust. When a person moves from being written about to doing the writing, something in them tends to settle. So go back to that calendar, not to blow it up and not to feel guilty about it, just to read it and then do one thing, because reading alone won't move you. And I'd be lying if I'd say it would. This week, pick the single lowest cost sentence you've been carrying as a must. The one that read honestly is only a can. The smallest one. And take the smallest irreversible version of it before Thursday. And hear this clearly, because it matters especially if your problem was never that you don't act, if you've acted your whole life and it left you hollow. The smallest irreversible action is allowed to be subtraction. It does not have to be sending, publishing, building, doing one more thing. It can be deleting a should you've been carrying for a decade. Declining the recurring block, canceling the standing meeting nobody would defend, saying the no you only turned into a yes because the no felt expensive. Crossing out one of your own sentences on purpose is every bit as much authorship as writing a new one. And for some of you, that's the braver line. Whichever direction it runs, do it not because it's brave, and not to prove a point, but because the demotion from must to can doesn't finish in your head. Only the doing does that. Your body has to watch the feared consequence fail to arrive. Or, if you subtracted, watch the sky stay up when you finally stopped. And then, the sentence I'd leave you sitting with, the one you can carry into any ordinary day, where the answer can already be different by the next one. Look at the line in front of you, the one you're about to obey, and ask, who is writing my story today and why isn't it me?